March in New England is supposed to be the end of winter. The worst storms come in January and February, when the cold is deepest and the ocean churns with the fury of a season at full strength. By March, the days are lengthening, the sun is warming, the worst is presumed to be past. People in Connecticut in 1888 were already thinking about spring planting, about the mud that would come with the thaw, about putting winter behind them for another year. They were not thinking about what the ocean was doing 300 miles to the south, where a cold front from Canada was colliding with warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico in a combination that meteorologists of the era could not predict and would not have believed if someone had described it. They were not thinking about the storm that was forming off the coast, a storm that would drop 50 inches of snow across 4 states, that would pile drifts to 50 feet in some locations, that would strand trains and bury houses and kill over 400 people who had no warning that the worst blizzard in American history was about to descend on them in the month when winter was supposed to be ending. Clara Ashworth was thinking about it. She had been thinking about it for 4 years, ever since the March storm of 1884 had killed her husband Samuel and her 2 sons, Thomas and William. They had been out checking the fishing boats when the storm came in faster than anyone expected, and the sea had taken them the way the sea takes everyone eventually, without warning, without mercy, without any concern for the families left behind to bury empty coffins and wonder if there was anything they could have done differently. Clara had decided there was. She had decided that the next time a storm came, she would be ready. Not ready the way other people meant when they said ready, with extra firewood and food in the pantry and boards over the windows. Ready in a way that meant survival was certain rather than merely hoped for, in a way that left nothing to chance, in a way that her neighbors found excessive and her minister found evidence of mental instability. She had built a shelter, not a cellar in the ordinary sense, not a hole in the ground for storing vegetables and hiding from summer heat. She had built a fortress against winter itself, a stone chamber sunk into the hillside behind her house, reinforced with timbers that could hold the weight of a collapsed building, supplied with food and water and fuel sufficient to sustain life for weeks, ventilated through shafts that could not be blocked by any amount of snow, heated by a fireplace with a chimney that rose high enough to stay clear of any drift. The project had taken 4 years. Clara had hired masons and carpenters when she could afford them, and done the work herself when she could not. Her daughter-in-law Mary, widowed by the same storm that had taken Clara's sons, had helped when the pregnancy permitted and watched with concern when it did not. The savings that Samuel had accumulated over 30 years of fishing had drained away stone by stone, timber by timber, until there was nothing left except the house and the land and the structure that everyone in the village called the tomb. The name had started with Reverend Harmon. He had visited Clara 6 months into the construction, ostensibly to offer spiritual comfort, but actually to assess whether the widow Ashworth had lost her mind and needed to be removed from the management of her own affairs. He had walked through the excavation, examined the walls that were already rising, listened to Clara explain her intentions, and emerged shaking his head with the satisfied expression of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. "She is building herself a tomb," Harmon announced to the congregation that Sunday. "The widow Ashworth has been so consumed by grief that she is preparing her own burial chamber while still among the living. She speaks of storms and survival, but what she is building is a monument to death, a hole in the ground where she intends to wait for the end that she believes is coming. We must pray for her soul and consider whether intervention is necessary to protect her from herself. The congregation had murmured agreement, because that is what congregations do when ministers speak. And the word had spread through the village with the speed that gossip always travels. And within a week, everyone was calling Clara's shelter the tomb, and speculating about when she would finally be committed to the asylum that her behavior so clearly warranted. Clara heard all of it. She heard the whispers when she walked through the village. She heard the children call her the tomb lady when they thought she could not hear. She heard Reverend Harmon suggest to the village selectmen that her property should be placed in trust for her own protection. And she heard the selectmen decline because she had not actually done anything illegal, and they did not want the expense of caring for her if she became a ward of the town. She heard, and she continued building, because she had learned something about storms that the people who mocked her had not learned. She had learned that storms do not care about opinions. She had learned that the sea does not listen to ministers. She had learned that the only protection against catastrophe is preparation, and that the people who laugh at preparation are usually the first to die when catastrophe arrives. The cellar was completed in the autumn of 1887. The final stones were set, the final timbers were placed, the heavy doors were hung on their iron hinges. Clara stocked the space with barrels of water and crates of preserved food, with firewood and blankets and oil for the lamps, with everything that 80 or 90 people might need to survive underground for a week or more. 80 or 90. Not 2. She had built for the village that mocked her, not just for herself, because she understood something else that Reverend Harmon did not understand. That when the storm came, she would not be able to watch her neighbors die outside her door simply because they had been foolish enough to laugh. The winter of 1887 to 88 was mild. January brought a few storms, nothing unusual. Nothing that challenged the ordinary preparations of ordinary families. February was cold but calm, and by early March the village was already looking forward to spring, already planning for the fishing season, already forgetting about the widow Ashworth and her tomb that sat unused in the hillside, evidence of obsession that had proven unnecessary. March 11th, 1888. Began as a pleasant day. The temperature was in the 40s, warm for early March, and people moved through their routines with the pleasant awareness that winter was releasing its grip. Some farmers talked about early planting. Some fishermen talked about going out for the first catch of the season. Everyone talked about the weather with the complacent assumption that the worst was behind them. The snow began falling that evening. Light at first, nothing alarming, just a late-season storm that would drop a few inches and be forgotten by morning. Clara watched it from her window and felt something that she could not have explained to anyone, a tightness in her chest, a whisper from the part of her mind that had been watching the sky and the sea for 4 years, waiting for the storm that would justify everything she had built. She turned to Mary. "We should go to the cellar tonight." Mary looked up from her sewing, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. The baby was due in 3 weeks, and she was tired, and the walk to the cellar was not easy, even in good weather. Tonight, it is just a spring snow. It will be gone by morning. Clara shook her head. "Look at the way it is falling. Look at the wind. This is not a spring snow." Mary looked out the window. The snow was heavier now, falling at an angle that suggested wind, and the temperature seemed to be dropping. She had learned to trust her mother-in-law's instincts about weather, the instincts that had kept Clara alive when so many others had died, the instincts that had driven her to build the shelter that everyone called a tomb. "All right," Mary said. "I will gather what we need." They were in the cellar by midnight, the heavy doors sealed behind them, the fire lit in the stone fireplace, the lamps casting warm light across the space that Clara had spent 4 years building. Outside, the snow was falling harder, the wind was rising, and the temperature was dropping towards 0. Inside, the air was still and warm, and the thick stone walls blocked all sound from the surface. Clara did not sleep. She sat by the fire and listened to Mary's steady breathing and waited, though she did not know what she was waiting for. Perhaps she was waiting for the storm to justify her obsession. Perhaps she was waiting for proof that she was not mad. Perhaps she was simply waiting, the way she had been waiting for 4 years, for something that would make sense of the grief that had driven her to dig this hole in the earth. The pounding on the door came just before dawn. Clara had built the entrance to slope upward from the cellar to the surface, so that snow could not block the doors by accumulating against them. But the pounding was frantic, desperate, the sound of fists beating against wood with the urgency of people who were dying and knew it. She opened the inner door and climbed the stairs to the outer door and lifted the bar and pulled. And the wind nearly knocked her backward as it rushed in, carrying snow that stung her face like sand. On the threshold stood 3 figures, so covered in white that they looked like ghosts, their faces barely visible behind scarves and frost. "Please," the voice was barely audible over the wind. "Please let us in." Clara stepped aside. The 3 figures stumbled past her and down the stairs into the warmth below, and she fought the door closed against the wind and dropped the bar into place and followed them down. They were the Peterson family, father, mother, son. Their house was half a mile away, and they had tried to stay, but the roof had begun to collapse under the weight of snow, and they had fled into the storm because staying meant being buried alive. They had walked toward Clara's property because they knew the tomb was there, because even people who mocked the widow Ashworth knew where her shelter was. And when their house began to fail, the shelter they had laughed at was the only hope they could think of. More came. The Hendersons arrived an hour after the Petersons, 6 people who had watched their barn collapse and decided their house would be next. The Marshalls came mid-morning, a family of 8 whose woodpile had been buried so deep that they could not reach it and whose fire had gone out. The Grimes family, the Reeves family, the Whitfields with their 5 children, and their elderly grandmother, who had to be carried through drifts that reached above the men's waists. By noon, there were 40 people in Clara's cellar. By nightfall, 60. By the morning of the second day, when the storm was still raging and the snow was still falling, and the world above had become an impassable white void, 85 people had found their way to the tomb that they had mocked, had pounded on the doors that they had called evidence of madness, had descended into the shelter that Reverend Harmon had said was a monument to death. Reverend Harmon himself arrived on the second evening. He came alone, without his fine black coat, without his ministerial dignity, without anything except the desperate need to survive that strips away everything inessential. He had tried to shelter in the church, but the church roof had collapsed under the weight of snow, and he had nearly died when a beam fell inches from where he had been standing. He had walked through the storm for 2 hours, following the path that others had broken, losing his way 3 times and finding it again only by luck or providence or the same instinct that drives dying animals toward any source of warmth. Clara opened the door for him as she had opened it for everyone else. She did not comment on the irony. She did not remind him of the sermons he had preached about her madness. She simply stepped aside and let him enter and closed the door against the wind that was still trying to kill everyone it could reach. The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, 85 people lived in the space that Clara had built over 4 years, eating the food she had stockpiled, burning the firewood she had stored, drinking the water she had cached in barrels along the walls. The cellar was crowded. The air grew stale despite the ventilation shafts. The children grew restless, and the adults grew tense, and tempers frayed as the hours stretched into days and the storm showed no sign of ending. But no one froze. No one starved. No one died of exposure or suffocation or any of the other deaths that the blizzard was dealing out across 4 states, killing over 400 people who had not built shelters, who had not prepared, who had assumed that March meant the end of winter and had been wrong. Mary went into labor on the 3rd night. The baby was early, brought on by the stress and the crowding and the fear that even the strongest could not entirely suppress. Clara delivered her grandson in the alcove where she had stored the blankets, while 84 people waited in the main chamber and tried not to listen to Mary's cries. The baby was small but healthy, a boy who came into the world in a tomb that had become something else entirely, a shelter that had saved everyone who reached it. The storm ended on the morning of March 14th. The wind died. The snow stopped. The survivors emerged from the cellar into a world that was unrecognizable, a landscape of drifts that buried houses to their roof lines and created new hills where flat ground had been. The sun was shining. The sky was brilliant blue. The contrast between the beauty of the morning and the destruction that covered everything was almost impossible to process. 23 people died in the village during the Great Blizzard of 1888. 23 people who had not reached the tomb, who had frozen in their homes or frozen trying to reach the homes of others, or frozen in the collapse of buildings that could not bear the weight of 50 inches of snow. 23 deaths in a storm that killed over 400 across New England, because 85 people had found their way to the shelter that one widow had built over 4 years while everyone called her mad. The reckoning that Clara expected never came. There was no public meeting, no gathering in the church where people stood and apologized and acknowledged that they had been wrong. The church itself was destroyed. The roof collapsed. The pews buried under snow that would not melt until May. There was only the slow work of digging out, of rebuilding, of burying the dead and caring for the living and trying to understand how a storm like this could have happened when everyone thought winter was over. Reverend Harmon came to Clara's door 3 days after the storm ended. He came alone in the early morning when no one would see him, and he stood on her threshold with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I have come to apologize." Clara looked at him. The man who had called her cellar a tomb. The man who had suggested she should be committed. The man who had stood in the pulpit and told the congregation to pray for her troubled soul while she was building the shelter that had saved his life. "You do not need to apologize to me," she said. "You need to help me dig a new well." The storm collapsed the old one. Harmon looked up, startled. He had expected confrontation, accusation, the righteous anger of a woman vindicated. He had not expected to be put to work. "Yes," he said. "Of course. I will help." Clara nodded and handed him a shovel. The apologies could wait. The gratitude could wait. The acknowledgement of who had been right and who had been wrong could wait. There was work to do, and work was how Clara Ashworth had always processed everything, from grief to vindication to the simple daily business of staying alive. The village rebuilt around the shelter that had saved it. Families who had lost their homes stayed in Clara's cellar while they constructed new ones. The supplies she had stockpiled fed the community until the roads cleared and new provisions could be brought in. The space that everyone had called a tomb became the center of recovery, the heart of a village that had nearly died and had survived because one widow had refused to let her grief be meaningless. Clara never called it anything but the cellar. She did not give it a name, did not put up a plaque, did not commission any monument to what had happened during those 3 days in March. When visitors came to see the shelter that had saved 85 lives, she showed them the stone walls and the timber beams and the ventilation shafts and the fireplace, and she explained how she had built it and why. And then she sent them on their way with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized everything she did. The baby born during the storm was named Samuel after Clara's husband. Mary raised him in the house overlooking the sea, and he grew up knowing the story of the storm and the shelter, knowing that he had been born in a place that everyone had called a tomb until it turned out to be the opposite. He became a builder himself, constructing houses and barns and the storm cellars that every family in the region began to demand. After the blizzard of '88 proved that March could be as deadly as January. Clara Ashworth died in the winter of 1901 at the age of 71. She died in her sleep, in the house she had shared with Samuel for 30 years, with Mary beside her and young Samuel holding her hand. She was buried next to the empty coffins of her husband and sons, in the cemetery overlooking the sea that had taken them, and that she had spent the rest of her life preparing to survive. The cellar she built still exists. The stone walls have not shifted in over a century. The timber beams are beginning to show their age, but still hold the weight of the earth above. The heavy doors still open on their iron hinges, though they are rarely used now except when historians come to document what remains. There is no marker explaining what happened in March of 1888. Clara did not want one, and Mary honored her wishes. The shelter speaks for itself, the way Clara always preferred things to speak, through construction rather than words, through preparation rather than promises, through the simple fact of 85 people who walked out of that door alive when they should have been dead. The villagers stopped calling it the tomb after the blizzard. They never called it anything else, officially. But when they spoke of it among themselves, when they told their children and grandchildren about the storm and the survival, they used a different word. They called it the Ark.